Hello, creative writers. Welcome to our first installation of class from a distance. As you probably have already guessed, because you have probably already looked at the document that I sent you, this week's installation is going to be about poetry, and and it's going to be one of two installations. I had wanted to do this as sort of one long discussion, but I think it's just too difficult. There's a few things to talk about, and there's no sense in doing this too quickly, right? This is the idea of what I'm going to try to do is to give you, I guess, some sense for the feel of what poetry in English. And as I said, we've talked about this before. It's a weird thing. I mean, poetry isn't really. It doesn't really make sense to teach it, right? Because it's sort of this strange way of conveying certain things, certain feelings, you know. And it's a very particular thing. And my experience with it is it's something that you sort of just get sometimes, and sometimes you don't. Sometimes it doesn't make any sense to read poetry. I mean, because you read it, you might be preoccupied or who knows what for whatever reason, right? Whatever is going on in your life or in the world at that time, and you might just read it and it doesn't do anything to you and it just doesn't make sense. It seems like it's just a stupid thing to do to read poetry, right? And also of course to write it at certain times. Let's say if you're going to try to write a poem, it just doesn't make any sense, right? So it's I mean, a lot of people compare it to music. I very often compare it to music, and there are some people that like certain kinds of music, and there are some other people that like others. So it is a little bit, from the outset, a little bit. It's a little bit difficult to teach, right? Because of that, especially because this is a creative writing class, and what I said about writing fiction, holds true for poetry, and maybe even more so, because it's a little bit more, particular, right? It's a little bit more sort of individual and personal and all that kind of stuff. So, what we're gonna do is, so first of all, say that if you just don't like poetry, I think that's sort of a healthy attitude, and maybe the introduction to that would be, if you look on the document that I gave you. Now, if you just to talk about this document, right? It's sort of the first part of it is it's sort of a history in a sense. It's a peculiar. It's not in sort of a definitive or it's probably not the most objective history of poetry. It's very centered on English poetry. And it goes through Renaissance poetry. Then we're going to talk about the classical age, the 18th century. We're going to go through the Romantic period, the Victorian period, and then we're going to go up to the sort of the early 20th century, the first half of the 20th century. And so in that document, you will notice towards the end, when we have our the last period that is considered in this document is the early 20th century, which is very often, much of this period is referred to as what we call, the modernist period. And one of the poets is Marianne Moore, an American poet from the early 20th century. And one of the poems that's listed there is called Poetry. And it's sort of her, what is known as her, what they said in Latin, her Ars Poetica. En français, on va dire art poétique, right? And this is sort of a thing that poets do. They kind of write a poem about what they think poetry is, And Marianne Moore starts by saying, in her poem on poetry, she says, "I too don't like it." So that's just to say is that there is this sort of healthy mistrust of poetic sentiment. This sort of a lot of this whole enterprise of sort of being, a lot of it is sort of a posture about what it is to be a poet or not. So that's sort of a healthy thing, and that I think is an echo of a quotation that becomes very kind of relevant today. Is Stendhal's he has a famous quotation on poetry where he says, "L'ère de la poésie est morte, l'ère du soupçon est venue au monde," and so if you think that poetry is just BS, if you think it's just a joke, that's kind of healthy. I think that's sort of a healthy attitude to have with respect to it, right? And so I kind of want to talk about I would say what we might describe as the heyday of poetry, of English poetry. And this is much like what we did with the novel. If you remember, you're all writing contemporary stuff. You're writing stuff about today. So there's kind of this paradox is that to really, get into writing fiction, we went into sort of, when fiction was really relevant. I tried to say that, in the 19th century, for example, we sort of looked at the 19th century novel, and we were saying that it was pretty much like a blockbuster Hollywood movie, right? And the same thing applies to poetry. The reason, but notice here we're looking at a lot of older stuff. And I said that, I didn't even recommend going back as far as the 18th century as far as reading fiction is concerned. I mean, you can, but for me, it strikes me as sort of an affair for specialists. You might be interested in it. But I said personally, I usually am much more bored if I read an 18th century novel than if I read a 19th century novel. And there's obviously, there are some exceptions, we talk about them, but it wasn't really the time when fiction writing was as relevant as it was in the 19th century, right? So the same thing kind of applies to poetry, insofar as the reason really we're going to look at a lot of older stuff is it's good if you want to get a feel for what it is. It's probably the best chances that you have sort of getting into it, right? Or sort of realizing, that's why do people make such a big deal about this thing? It's to sort of expose yourself to the poetry that was written in a period when many more people wrote it. It was more relevant, right? And many more people read it, and they probably didn't read it for the same reasons, right? It was that reading poetry was a different kind of activity, right, than it was now, and it made more sense, right? And I think one of the reasons why what I just quoted Marianne Moore and also Stendhal there is some argument to say that actually today poetry, it doesn't really make sense to write poetry. There's a lot of other things you can do. Whereas in these earlier periods, the relationship between, let's say, the reader, the poet, and society meant that poetry, it kind of made sense. So we're going to kind of go back through that, right? We're going to kind of look at the things that poetry was kind of capable of expressing in those periods. And also the idea is, once again, you don't have to read any of this stuff, but we're going to look at it, we're going to look at some critics, what they say about it, and I'm going to sort of mention a few poets on the way. And the idea is, you're going to, maybe when you hear something about a certain poet, you go, oh yeah, that looks interesting to me. That's something I might want to get into. And those are the ones you check out, right? That's the idea. So as I said, we're going through sort of a vast historical kind of fresco over a few centuries of mostly English poetry. We're going to look at mostly English poetry, a little bit of Irish poetry, and then towards the end of the period, we're going to look at a lot more American poetry. And to do this, we're going to kind of have a guide, and our guide is going to be, this is an author we've already talked about, the American poet T.S. Eliot. Even though he actually became English towards the end of his life, some people think of him as an English poet. And I say this because if you go to the library, when the library is open again at Paris 8, you will notice that T.S. Eliot is found with the English poets. And it's not exactly obvious because he ended up moving there. He actually became a member of the Church of England, which is pretty unusual thing. He describes himself as a royalist, so that's a pretty weird position for an American. We could get into that. I would love for us to have a discussion about T.S. Eliot. He's a pretty strange figure, but he was a poet himself, and he was also a critic, and his criticism that he wrote in the I would say especially starting from the Edwardian period, right, which we said went up into that, which is from 1900 to 1914, and then into the 20s, right, which we can think of it being sort of the modernist period as far as literature is concerned. So his critical writings of that time really kind of changed the way a lot of people think about poetry, and they can actually kind of open it up. So that's what I claim. So how did they open this up? So T.S. Eliot was, he had something very paradoxical about what he wrote, was that he was very interested in this sort of literary, what we might call the literary tradition. And he was convinced that the only way to really make something new, and his stuff was very, avant-garde, very cutting edge. And I'm glad that a lot of you had already read The Wasteland. We talked about The Wasteland. I said that it might be a good idea for you to go and read The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. And this was pretty cutting edge stuff. I mean, this is he's pushing the limits of syntax and grammar and meaning, and it's chock full of references to everything from the Bible, Dante, Shakespeare, Baudelaire, you name it, right? So we said that this is sort of what James Joyce was doing. So it's sort of like this. It's almost as if what happens with Joyce, is that it's sort of this implosion of Western culture. It's as if in his poems, right, they're so compact and there's so many references and they're so full of all this stuff, of all the history of and it's not just poetry, but Western culture as a whole. It sort of explodes, it sort of overwhelms, and it leads to something very, in something that is supposed to represent like the whole of a cultural, is sort of a fragmented thing, and it's sort of like bits and pieces of it. And it doesn't really function as a whole very well, right? So that's sort of the paradox of T.S. Eliot. It's very kind of modern and in his time very contemporary and very cutting edge, and yet at the same time it harkens back to a lot of old stuff. So and that's in a way that's sort of a sensibility that I think might be useful to you, because he wanted to make his poetry kind of relevant, right? He wanted to make it sort of really kind of alive to what was happening, when he was writing it. And the only way to do that was to sort of go back to poetry when poetry was more alive, right? Okay, so we're going to talk about kind of those periods. Now, as you might have guessed, just like we always do, we're going to start with Shakespeare, right? Which is not, in a sense, because a lot of people will put Shakespeare, at the center of the English-speaking canon, and it is true that what is good is that I don't have to repeat what I already said about Shakespeare. I talked about the Globe. I talked about the fact that there was all the people that there all the different layers of society would actually go to the Globe Theatre in London, and there was the fact that it had to appeal to all social classes on a lot of different levels, right? So that poetry, and he really, and it's what is interesting about Shakespeare. One of the reasons it's most difficult is not because of the, I would say, of course it can be very sophisticated poetically and with the structure of the verse and this kind of thing, but also it's full of slang, like argot, and we're talking about slang from 16th, 17th century England. That makes it really difficult to understand, right? So that is actually one of the main difficult. When I read Shakespeare, is one of the most difficulties that I have is these are all these slang words, right? That are in there that for slang that is 400 years old is pretty hard to understand. So that's one thing we should keep in mind. So T.S. Eliot, and he has his sort of program. He really wants to make contemporary poetry relevant, and he goes on to say that when Shakespeare was writing, he doesn't say. I gave you the sort of the sociological reason why Shakespeare was sort of alive, right? He says that another reason. Well, he doesn't mention this sociological reason. He says and by the way, I'm referring to a collection of critical essays which are in the Sacred Wood, which is there's a reference to this that you'll find. Mostly, I would say in the Sacred Wood. That's something he wrote just before the 20s. You'll find most of these references there. So in the Sacred Wood, T.S. Eliot is really trying to look at when and how English poetry was more alive and it was more dead, right? So he says that it was the most alive when Shakespeare was writing, right? And he says that it wasn't alive for the reason that most people give, because for Eliot's contemporaries, people said that poetry is most alive because poetry was young, right? It was sort of spontaneous. That it sort of was sort of it hadn't become too self-conscious, right? It also hadn't become stifled by convention, right? By the way, later we're going to see when we get into the 17th and 18th century, many people claim that this sort of poetry has already become sort of old, and the poetic norms that the poets try to respect, they kind of make it a little bit deader, right? So Eliot's contemporaries sort of claim that, society was younger. We're at a younger stage of society, right? And it's really important also to note that we're in a pre-scientific age, right? The 17th century is really the rise and the victory of science in culture, right? And Shakespeare is writing before that, right? So Eliot says that when Shakespeare was writing, he talks about the point where poetry becomes less lively in what he refers to as his phrase is the dissociation of sensibility, right? The dissociation of sensibility. And the sensibilities he's talking about are thinking and feeling, right? Now he says what's good about Shakespeare, is he says, part of being poetry, is when and this is, by the way, I think it's really interesting to think about this when you're writing, fiction or poetry. A lot of poetry is sound, right? We're not gonna. It's too bad if you've ever been in a phonetics class. I like to do poetry in phonetics because we study sound, and there's certain sound patterns. There's a thing called meter. For example, if we want to look at, let's say, a line from Shakespeare, I could say, "So long as eyes can see and lips can breathe, so long lives this, and this belongs to thee." Right. So you'll notice there's a certain rhythm to it. So long as lips can breathe and eyes can see. You notice there's this ba 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 ba. You can hear it, right? So long as lips can breathe and eyes can see. That's a line of poetry, right? Okay. That is a 10-syllable line. So long as lips can breathe and eyes can see. There's 10 syllables, right? And it's divided into 2-syllable feet. And there are 5 2-syllable feet. So long as lips can breathe and eyes can see, right? 5 2-syllable feet. And they start with a non-stress syllable, and then they end with a stress syllable, long. So long as lips can breathe and eyes can see, right? And then it ends, this is the end of a sonnet. So long lives this, and this belongs to thee. And that's the end of the sonnet. It ends with a couplet, a rhymed couplet. So we notice that there is this, that's what we call meter and versification. It has to do with sound patterns. So what I'm saying is poetry has a lot to do with sound, right? And T.S. Eliot says, yes, sound has a lot to do with feeling. If you hear certain sounds, they can make you feel in a certain way. They can kind of sweep you away. They can kind of put you to sleep. They can kind of wake you up. So it is true that there is a significant relationship between emotion and sound, right? And T.S. Eliot claims that there is sort of a temptation not to think when you write poetry, right? And just to rely on sound to make you feel certain things, right? And he says that this is what happens after Shakespeare. He says that this is what happens, and notably I'm going to refer to a poet that has often been criticized by Eliot and his more modernist contemporaries. And this poet is John Milton, who you will find in the list. John Milton wrote later. He wrote 30, 40 years after Shakespeare, mid 17th century, right? And according to, and this is a very debated theory, but according to Eliot, with Milton, by the way, Milton is a master of sound. He went blind. It would be interesting. I would suggest reading this. I myself am guilty of liking Milton too much, because perhaps I don't like to think, but it's basically like when you listen to a song that just sort of makes you dream or something like that. He really was a master of assonance and consonance and rhythm, and the rhythm itself kind of puts you into a spell, right? You're kind of spellbound when you read Milton. It kind of sweeps you away. And so the ones I wrote there, I said that you might want to try reading the sonnets. When he's younger, there's a couple of poems he wrote that you will find there called the L'Allegro and the Il Penseroso, and they're sort of a pair, they're sort of a diptych. Here he's beginning with his sort of sound experiments. And it's interesting, is the first one, he's sort of talking about sort of poetic excitement. And the second one, Il Penseroso, it means, the meditative man, and it's more about this sort of contemplative mood, right? And he, in these poems, Milton uses sound to sort of put you into this sort of very calm, peaceful mood. That would be in Il Penseroso, and in the L'Allegro, he uses sound and rhythm to kind of inspire you with excitement. For example, in L'Allegro, one of the more memorable lines is, "Straight mine eye has caught new pleasures while the world around it measures," and it really sticks out and it really hits you. So you might want to try reading that. It sounds really good and it puts you into a state. So, coming back to our idea, or we should say, coming back to Eliot's thesis, Eliot says that with Milton kind of fell into a trap. Right? He became sort of addicted to sound, right? And he wasn't really thinking. Now, that's, in a sense, it's kind of unfair, right? It would be pretty crazy to think that Milton didn't think himself, right? For example, he was a very learned man. He was a master of languages. You can imagine that he was he was not an idiot. Let's just put it that way. And to give you an idea of the kind of thinking that T.S. Eliot is talking about, is that we should look at the other book that I referred to which is Paradise Lost, which is an epic, which is one of the few verse epics. It's difficult to write verse epics written in English, right? Which means that we're talking about the Greek and Roman models, right, of Homer and Virgil. Right, so the content of Paradise Lost is a rewriting of the story of Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis. Right, so it's a religious epic, and the poem is really sort of an allegory. There's about good and evil. So it could be said that